to give a little bit of an introduction, I'm a living environment teacher in Jamaica, Queens. This is my 5th year teaching. I teach 9th graders and I love it. I've taught 12th graders before and I found that they were sometimes comatose in the classroom, but I love the livelihood in 9th graders and they're always excited about everything. The school is pretty small. It's about 100 students per grade level, and I'm fortunate enough to have a fairly small class size, around 20 students per class, and the student population is very, very diverse. I mean, the Jamaica Queens is very diverse in and of itself, and most of the students are very poor. And so just to give you a little, background on the project, starting in about mid-November, and this is kind of towards the end of a cycle switch that we do. I had students embark on a 2-week culminating project that required them to demonstrate mastery of some skills and some concepts in a very realistic setting. And I also, just so you know, I took teaching and curriculum last semester. So anyway, next slide, please.
I just got a little behind, so I will open it up in a minute. Just start talking while I find that particular texture.
Didn't realize your chat was off. So, anyway, so a little bit of the project overview. For 2 weeks, students in groups of 3 were investigating a crime scene. The crime scene took place in our school building, and all the teachers on staff that day were possible suspects. And I made sure to get the worst possible photos, mugshots of every single teacher on staff. And I also set up a fairly realistic crime scene where there was a fake body, there was fake blood. I took hair samples from most of the teachers that were willing to give hair samples. And so students gathered evidence. They got blood work, hair samples, fiber samples. I left footprints from multiple teachers. They got fingerprints, and then they charged the suspect with a crime and had to defend their accusation in the courtroom. And something that I forgot to mention is that, in the beginning of this this project, I kind of had, kind of a hook where I said, there's been a crime committed in the building, and all the teachers in the building are potential suspects, and we're going to be investigating the crime. And so, I kind of hooked them early about, well, you are, going to be doing the work of a scientist. This is not going to be the usual, work that you do in a classroom. Next slide, please.
Hello?
Here's someone right now.
Yeah. Would you all be sure to turn your speak button off while Andrew's talking?
So, as far as the presentation component, that occurred essentially a week after they started gathering evidence. They gathered evidence, and then we kind of went through a week where they would do tests and analysis of the evidence. They would do what's called a gel electrophoresis, which is a procedure where they take the DNA, they segment it, and it allows them to compare crime scene DNA with the DNA of the suspects right down the road. I spoke with a detective at the local police precinct, so I made it easy on them. In the future, maybe I'll have them contact their witnesses, but it was really cool for them. And one of the things that I really like about Skype is, and I think it really is an underutilized tool in the classroom, is that it's so easy to set up, it's so inexpensive, logistically, it's much easier to get an expert into the classroom through Skype than require them to take a day out of their work schedule and bring them in. And it really extends the reach of your classroom, and it totally increases the relevancy of the lesson. People are able to talk to a real life detective, banter back and forth about what are your crime scene techniques, and it was entertaining, and they really enjoyed it. So anyway, that was the presentation component. They had to basically argue their findings in front of a jury. They had to explain it, and then next slide, please. This next slide is going to talk kind of about their assessment. So there was a peer evaluation component to their assessment. Each peer had a feedback sheet to give back to the presenters, about organization, whether they were able to explain the important concepts, whether they were able to, come to the correct conclusion, all those things. And also, I forgot to mention, but it took about 30 minutes for each group of 3 to present their findings, to have their Skype witness testify. So, I had the more prepared groups go first to serve as a model for the groups that were, I think, less prepared, and I think it helped the groups that were kind of a little bit lost as to how to argue certain points, because it's a very novel thing to have to stand in front of a fake jury and argue your points. So it was beneficial to put the best groups, or more prepared groups, first. And then finally, I evaluated the performance based on a rubric that was shown to students ahead of time, which is so instrumental anytime you're doing a project, is to have it to show the rubric well ahead of time, so they know exactly how they're being evaluated, what are the components for success. So I gave them it ahead of time.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. So next slide, please.
I can't figure out what I'm doing.
We have somebody in the back who doesn't have their mic turned off. And we're hearing household noises, so please be sure your mics are turned off.
Adds to the relevancy of the second life. So anyway, one of the major advantages to this project was obviously the rollback that it would experience to the students, and they were practicing the work of forensic scientists and prosecutors. So I wanted to provide a realistic portrayal of what a crime-fighting team would have to go through in order to prove that someone was guilty. They gather the same types of evidence and the techniques used by professionals. I wanted a courtroom experience that closely mimicked as much as possible what they would go through. And that was the realistic component, was just so incredibly valuable in terms of their engagement. Like, not that I have tremendous troubles with classroom management or anything, but when they're hooked, you can go into every day and they're so eager to get started with the lesson, and you don't have to get them to sit down. They're just so engaged already. So it was just a really big teaching point for me to, in the future, for not just for long projects, but for every lesson, explain how it's relevant to their lives, and explain how these skills can be used in the future if they continue in a career in science. Anyway, I just really wanted to be as realistic as possible. So next slide, please. So I teach in a school that is Regents-based. I used to teach in a school that had a waiver from the Regents, and it was portfolio-based. So at the end of the year, they had to do a project, similar to something like they do here. So the reason why I mentioned that is that I constantly face this this struggle of pacing. I'm always thinking about, well, is this going to prevent me from getting through the rest of the year? Am I able to fit this in? So I say that because I wanted to make sure that this project captured skills and concepts that really would be tested on the Regents, but could be used or could be, you know, brought up in a different way that was a little bit more exciting to them than, like, you know, a traditional test prep or environment like that. So, you know, it allowed me to use many scientific tools. It allowed me to incorporate multiple units, and that's kind of why I did it at the end of the cycle, so I can incorporate the scientific method, I can incorporate genetics. So it allowed me to incorporate and tie in many, many, many units. And then it also, this kind of project lends itself to a very inquiry-based approach rather than a, you know, a more traditional teacher-centered environment. You know, students are really kind of taking, you know, the education into their own hands, so to speak. So I really, that was one of the big takeaways from this project. If you go to the next slide, please. So this next slide kind of talks just about the literacy and communication of the project. You know, just as any other subject, science has a unique literacy. You know, they need to be able to interpret figures. They need to be able to analyze data. You know, there's a jargon to science. And so really what I was interested in is having them explain in their own words their learning. And I think that the jury presentation really encouraged that, and that's kind of one of the reasons why I did the jury presentation. But I also wanted to have them communicate the information in a variety of formats. So I had them communicate their findings to the panel orally. I had them, as part of the rubric, it was required, but they all had to make a visual aid where they basically explained their findings, explained how to analyze their findings. And then finally, I had them conduct online research of articles. I wanted them to do that just kind of as an aside because, you know, scholarly articles, they have, you know, their own format, and I think it's important for them to get used to, you know, what's the abstract, you know, what are the methods, what is, you know, their experimental design. So there was a lot of literacy components to this project that, you know, and they're also, you know, lifelong skills that they can use in the future. So that's part of the reason why I wanted to have them do research. Can you do the next slide, please? So, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the integration of technology, obviously Skype was instrumental in bringing about those key witnesses. I also used a smartboard to explain this technique called a gel electrophoresis. I really wanted to use a smartboard because I wanted students to get up and almost teach their fellow students about these techniques that we use in the lab. I also had them create an Excel spreadsheet to track data, and you know, it was, you know, a Google Doc, and so they could all collaborated on it together. And then finally, gel electrophoresis, that's a very specific science technology that I had them use. I thought about having them use a PowerPoint and a projector, and early on in my teaching career, I mean, I was just as guilty of this as, you know, my students are, but I find that when I use PowerPoint with them, they throw, you know, everything in the kitchen sink up there on the screen, and it's just a mass of information that's incredibly difficult to digest. So my students are just standing in front of the screen, looking at it, not even engaging the audience, so the rest of the students become incredibly bored. So I think, you know, PowerPoint, while it's something that, you know, the skills of creating a good PowerPoint presentation can be taught, I think it was beyond me at that point. I didn't want to go too much into helping them develop PowerPoint skills, but it, you know, it could be used here. But also, I kind of wanted to stray away from just PowerPoint. You know, because, you know, PowerPoint is almost like a 20th century technology. I wanted to do like more of a 21st century technologies for this project. And also in terms of technology, they're obviously, you know, using the internet a lot. But yeah, next slide, please. So this should be challenges. Yeah, so I mean, as far as the challenges are concerned, and this is probably something that, you know, we will all face, is that there's such low internet access at home. And this is not just for this project, but this is just, you know, for, you know, when you think about assigning, you know, internet work at home, you always need to consider the fact that, well, a lot of these kids don't have access to the internet, you know, because they either don't pay the bills, or there's all these factors that come into play as to why there's low internet access. So